Hello again. You're listening to the news at 1. The latest figures today released by Daft.ie show that the rental crisis here is continuing to worsen for tenants. According to the website, it now costs an average of almost €1,700 a month to rent a property in this country. Between June and September, rents rose nationwide by an average of 4.3%. And that is by some distance the single largest quarterly increase ever recorded in the rental report that goes back to the start of 2006. The issue is nationwide, with a 14.3% annual increase in Dublin, an increase of 14.5% in other cities, and 13.8% outside the cities. Our reporter Fiachra Ó Cionnaith has been speaking to Regina Mangan, owner of Liberty Blue estate agents in Waterford City, about the reality of the rental market in her area and how it reflects the wider national picture.
So I think what we're seeing in Waterford is indicative of what's actually happening throughout the country. Landlords, they are racing out of the market, and nationally there's in the region of 600 properties being vacated or given notice every quarter, and the situation's getting worse and worse. And it just amazes me that government, their, I suppose, interference really in the market has actually made the situation way worse.
Can you go into some details about what you mean by that?
Okay, so first of all, we saw the rent pressure zone. It had the opposite effect of what they were trying to achieve. Let's not forget then that the average property owner pays in the region of 52% tax on that rental income. So at the end of getting €510 a month, they probably end up with a net somewhere in the region probably of about $220 per month. So they're racing out of the market, but there's nobody then replenishing the stock. So we are now seeing the situation getting worse and worse and worse.
And when you say, Regina, that landlords are racing out of the market, obviously the bottom line for many people listening to this is a shortage of accommodation when we are already in a housing crisis.
Oh yeah, it's very serious. I mean, today there's 6 properties advertised for rent in Waterford. That's typical for the last 2 years. 6, 7 properties, maybe 8 properties, maybe 9, but that's as much as is advertised on Daft at any given time for Waterford City. This Daft data is a reflection only of probably 1% of what's going on.
And that's Regina Mangan from the Liberty Blue estate agents in Waterford City. Well, we're joined here in studio by Professor Michelle Norris, who's director of the Geary Institute for Public Policy at University College Dublin and an expert in the causes of and potential solutions to our housing crisis. Professor Norris, you're very welcome to the programme. That's a pretty stark explanation of the situation in Waterford. At the moment, just 6 properties to rent on Daft.ie anyway in the entire city. Can we talk first of all about what's happening in relation to the small private landlords? Why are they exiting the business, the market, in such numbers?
Well, the proportion of the population renting privately increased very dramatically since the 1990s. And now we see small landlords in particular exiting the market. There's some evidence as to why they're leaving. Some of them may have paid down their mortgages. They may be out of negative equity. They just want to realise the capital gain on the property and move on. For a lot of landlords, though, it's no longer an attractive business proposition, and it is a business in the end of the day. So, first of all, private landlords, unlike all other business owners, are not taxed on their profits. They're taxed essentially on their turnover. They're taxed on the rent minus allowable deductions. So that's much more tax than, say, an owner of a shop might pay on their profits. The amount of tax they pay has increased in recent years because in the past they weren't subject to PRSI. So PRSI was applied to private landlords, and that significantly increased the supply. The third reason is regulation has changed very, very on a very regular basis in recent years. The sector was largely unregulated in the past, which is not a positive situation when obviously housing is a vital commodity for people. But particularly in the last couple of years, there's been enormous changes in regulation. I think there's been 6 separate pieces of legislation and amendments in the last 3 years alone. And those regulations have regulated both rents and landlords' ability to repossess the property and sell. So for tenants, obviously, that's repossessing the property is enormously negative, and they may risk homelessness.
So from what you're saying, there are things that could be done that, mightn't keep all landlords in the market, but that could stem to some extent the exodus which we've seen. Action could be taken.
Well, certainly I suppose the market is changing. So we think we know small landlords are leaving the market. There seems to be about 20,000 have left in recent years. We don't have definitive data. There are other landlords entering the market, big build-to-rent companies, for instance. But it's not a like-for-like replacement. The build-to-rent companies are primarily in Dublin. They're primarily at the high end of the market. Whereas if a landlord leaves the market in Waterford, they're often letting to a lower-income person, and they're very unlikely to be replaced.
I suppose at the heart of this is a shortage of supply. We just don't have enough homes, whether it's for people to buy or whether it's for people to rent or whether it's on the social and affordable. What are the key things that could really start? First of all, we're facing potentially a slowdown, I think, in completions next year. How concerning is that? And what needs to happen maybe in areas like planning and particularly in the provision of social affordable housing that can really begin to come to terms with this crisis?
Well, firstly, certainly on the small landlords, there is certainly a strong argument for action to be taken to try to stem their, disorderly exit from the market. You could call it, and that's quite an urgent situation because, as I mentioned, particularly where tenants are lower earners, they're on housing assistance payment, they're very likely to become homeless. I think, firstly, action on tax, albeit maybe just short term, is probably necessary. But just in terms of the rate of change and regulation, we've seen many changes, as I've mentioned, but to my knowledge, none of them have been modelled or tested for their impact on supply. So certainly, if there are further changes introduced, we need to properly research what will be the potential impact on supply. That's the first thing. On the social housing side of things for people on lower income, I suppose it's no secret that the supply of social housing just fell to levels which were too low, and we are far too dependent on things like housing assistance payment to house people. We have about 115,000 households on those types of subsidies at the moment, and there just isn't enough supply. So we need to increase output of social housing, but the key issue with social housing output at the moment is there's inadequate output in cities in particular. The output in rural areas is much better. And the second issue is there's inadequate output of small units. Most people who are homeless are single men. Most people on the housing list are single people, mainly single men, or a person households. They're generally lone parents with children. And that is really the area of social housing output we need to concentrate on. All
right. We'll leave it there, but perhaps we will, I'm sure, return to these issues and perhaps speak to you again at some point. Professor Michelle Norris from UCD, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.